This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Just the other day, I appeared on Bob's program, Athens Speak Out, and we discussed the Spanish Civil War. The reason being that the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War occurred, like I say, 80 years ago in 1936, in July 17th, 18th. Things were really bursting out all over in Spain, especially in the week following the 18th of July. And here it is, just a couple of days afterwards, and on the very day that is generally accepted as for the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, at least on the Spanish mainland, namely July 18th, was actually the opening day here in Cleveland, Ohio, of the Republican National Convention. And I'm speaking today on the last day of the convention itself, it being anticipated that the Republicans will officially nominate Donald Trump to be the candidate for U.S. president tonight, Thursday. Well, I want to point to my T-shirt, which usually is pretty well covered up by my name and the whole business about showing what's going on here at the table. But this is a T-shirt which was featured at a march at the Republican Convention opening day on Monday, July 18th. And it says, "End Poverty Now." And it was a T-shirt for the marchers who were protesting poverty, since Cleveland is one of the U.S. cities with the highest proportion of poverty of any United States city. So a number of marchers were marshaled in Cleveland on July 18th afternoon to march and to proclaim the ideal of ending poverty now. One of the people who helped to organize that march was Larry Bressler of Organize, Ohio. And for a number of years, I was board chair for Organize, Ohio, some years ago now. But Larry continues the work of Organize, Ohio in Cleveland, and he got together about 12 different groups who were supporting the march. I haven't really had any report about how the march went, but I assume that it occurred on July 18th. As I mentioned earlier, the Spanish Civil War's 80th anniversary is credited with July 18th this year, 2016, since it's 80 years since that time. And Bob and I spoke about the Spanish Civil War on his program, which I think is currently playing right now on Athens Speak Out, about the Civil War and our interest in it for many years. I personally, Bob and I, shall we say, personally, when we very first met in January of 1954, we talked about the Spanish Civil War. It was more of part of almost contemporary history back then, a long time ago now, over 60 years ago now, than it is today. And I want to repeat what I pointed out on the program, that many Americans confuse the Spanish-American War, which happened in the late 19th century, which happened in 1898 actually, when the United States and Spain went to war basically over Cuba. at that time, and the fact that the battleship Maine was blown up in Havana Harbor early in 1898, and that was part of the reason why the United States forces invaded Cuba. One of the most important, or at least most memorable parts of the Spanish-American War was the Rough Riders, who were led by Theodore Roosevelt, who was at the time, I believe, the governor of New York State. But he had grown up in New York City and had gone to the West and learned to shoot and ride and so forth, and he organized militia group called the Rough Riders to fight in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Well, as far as Spain was concerned, that was very bad news. That war saw the end of their colonial empire, which had been built up, of course, in the days following the so-called discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus, who was sent out by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, searching for a route to the Indies by sailing west instead of the long way around the Cape of Good Hope of Africa to get to the east to China and so on by sea in the 15th century. And of course, Columbus discovered that there was some land between Spain and China, namely the North and South American continents. And Spain managed to get much of that land under its sway, in at least as far as South America was concerned, except for Brazil, which the Portuguese got by a deal with that the Pope drew up to divide the newly discovered, so-called discovered lands between Spain and Portugal. But most of the rest of Latin America was Spanish, and of course the Mexicans. Mexico was taken over by Cortez about 1520 or thereabouts, and Spain ruled in Latin America for several centuries. And after losing much of South America and Mexico early in the 19th century, the very last parts of their colonial empire, the Philippines and Cuba, were actually taken over by the United States during the Spanish-American War of 1898. So, we're not talking about that, right? We're talking about the Spanish Civil War, which was an actual civil war like we had in America, in a sense, in the 150 years ago, when Abraham Lincoln led the Union forces as President of the United States against the Southern Secessionists' Confederacy. This was a civil war, and like the American Civil War, it was a very bloody war. It was fought with ferocity on both sides. The two participants in the Spanish Civil War were essentially the Second Spanish Republic, and on the other side, military coup, which occurred on July 17th and 18th, 1936. It began at that time and continued for almost 3 years, and was a scene of a lot of intervention from foreigners. The Germans and Italians, who were led by Hitler and Mussolini in those days, sent forces to Spain to help the military rebels, they were called, of course, by the other side, to fight. And ultimately, they were successful. And the leading general of the Spanish Civil War on the rightist side was Generalissimo Franco, who then became the leader of national Spain until 1975, when he finally passed away of old age. That was almost 40 years after it was at least 40 years after he'd come to power, because 40 years earlier he had been fighting actively the Spanish Civil War. On the other side was the Spanish Republic. The Spanish Republic had begun, it was actually the second one. There had been a brief first Spanish Republic in the 19th century, so it's often called the Second Spanish Republic. Was started in 1931, in the spring of 1931, when the ruling monarch, Alfonso XIII of Spain, went into exile and left, and a republic was set up which didn't have a king at its top. So it was the republic, the Spanish Republic, that the military rose up against in 1936, after the election in February of 1936 of a leftist coalition called the Popular Front, which included democratic groups and socialist groups, a number of socialist groups, initially a small communist party group, which gained a great deal of power during the Civil War, because the only nation that really sent substantial aid to the Spanish Republic was the Soviet Union, ruled by the communist dictator Joseph Stalin in those days. So, and as I said, in the meantime, the other side, the Franco and other generals who were involved with the military coup in 1936 were supported by the German Nazis and the Italian fascists. Well, I'm going to talk at greater length about a couple of the women involved in the Spanish Civil War. And as it happens, both of those women were supporters of the Spanish Republic. One was a communist functionary. Actually, she was vice president of the Spanish Cortes, or Parliament, after the elections in February 1936. And she's usually known by her nickname, La Pasionaria, the passionate one, a woman who was a communist organizer for years, had been an important communist organizer of Spain's small communist party at the time, and also a woman, an American woman, whom I'm going to speak about at greater length, by the name of Martha Gellhorn, who was a foreign correspondent in Spain, among other interesting things that she did in her life. And you see on the screen a picture of Martha Gellhorn, who was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, St. Louis. Her mother was a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. In fact, when Martha Gellhorn went off to college, her friend Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of the president, not the president yet, but the governor of New York State in the late 1920s, Mrs. Roosevelt invited Martha Gellhorn to Albany, to the governor's mansion for dinner. But we'll go into that at greater detail in a minute. First, I want to emphasize again the current political situation. The Republican convention is just winding up in Cleveland as I speak. And next week, the convention of the Democratic Party will be held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it is assumed that Hillary Clinton will be the nominee for president, the first woman to represent a major political party in a race for the presidency of the United States. So while we're talking about women in politics, I want to talk a little bit about my own mother, who was involved in politics, and there's an interesting coincidental connection with today. We have a couple of pictures of my mother. This shows her as a young woman on the left with her bobbed hair in the 1920s when she lived in Mexico. She and my father, Ed Daimel, my mother's maiden name was Lois Hatch, were married in 1923 and went off to Mexico, where he was working in Mazatlan, which is on the west coast of Mexico, and the port that was often used in the 19th century to make imports from China and Japan from the Far East. And he was working for a shipping firm in Mazatlan in the 1920s, when he and my mother lived there. He had gone early, he had left college early. She stayed in Berkeley and finished her degree in 1923. And then they were married that September 1923 and moved to Mexico, to Mazatlan. Mexico, interestingly, was just still recovering from a civil war that it had beginning about 1910, 11, 1912, when there was a civil war in Mexico. But by the time they were there, it was a much more peaceful country again, and they were there for about 3 years or 3.5 years. The other picture shows my mother in 1936. In 1936, she was involved in Democratic Party politics in the state where I grew up, namely Nevada. She had, my father had moved there in the early 1930s when he got a job at a big ranch about 60 miles as the crow flies from Las Vegas, in between Las Vegas and Death Valley at Pahrump. And they were there for about 4 years. Well, she got quite active in Democratic politics as early as 1934 and 1935, and in 1936 she was a delegate to the National Democratic Party Convention, which was held in, believe it or not, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, that was 80 years ago. I believe that's the last time that the Democratic Party had its convention in Philadelphia. And, you know, sort of that six ending kind of fitting in with the 1776, 1936, 2016 idea of Philadelphia, the founding city of the United States, where the Declaration of Independence was first proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. So, and my mother had an important part there. I guess maybe she was, well, no, they had a women's section of the Democratic Party in those times. Actually, she was named as one of the vice presidents of the Democratic Party's women's group in 1936. And when she returned to Nevada, she started campaigning to be in the state legislature. She was, as it turned out, the only woman who was elected to the Nevada Assembly in the fall of 1936, and in 1937 she began her career there. She had that one term in the Nevada legislature, but she continued very interested in Democratic politics, even after she moved to Fallon, Nevada, where my brother was born and lives to this day. And I think we have a third picture that shows the two of us. The one that you see on the left is a picture taken in 1934, and that's me at age 2, seated on that piano stool, and the photographer has just tricked me to stop crying and be interested in the hand puppet that he had in his hand, and so I have a nice big smile there. And my mother has a white hat on in 1934 in Los Angeles when we were visiting there in the summer of 1934. The other picture shows my mother in 1943 with my brother Bill. He's 10 years younger than I am, and this picture, he was born in 1942, and that's a picture of him at about age 1, and of course he's now an old gentleman with great-grandchildren who lives in Fallon, Nevada, just about 2,000 miles down the road from us, because it's on US Route 50 in the western part of Nevada, about 60 miles from Reno. So that shows my mother and her 2 children. But as I say, she did continue interested in Democratic politics to the end of her life. And she even visited once in Cuba in 1950. They were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the US setting up the Cuban school system. And they had representatives from every state in the Union, I guess, who went to Havana in those days. It was under the direction of the rightist, well, we would call him a kind of a dictator named Bautista, who was in charge in Cuba in 1950. My mother went, and she was, because of the years she had spent in Mexico and her familiarity with Spanish language, she was one of the few members of the delegation going in 1950 who actually spoke some Spanish and was able to talk to the Cubans herself. Well, she was a wonderful woman, of course, and she actually died too young of cancer in 1957 at a time when, it was in 1959, she was age 57 at the time, and I had my first brand new baby, so she was able to meet my baby Dickie and play piggy toes on his little toes. It's practically the last thing she said, because she died during the night, that night, of cancer, and was buried in California near where her parents are buried, in a little town called Lockford, which is about 15 miles north of Stockton and about 35 miles south of Sacramento, where she had lived for a time as a teenager, Lockford and Lodi, California. My brother and I still have a little vineyard there in Lodi that belonged to my grandparents, and we've had it ever since her death in 1959. Well, that's one woman from the past that I'm talking about, and her connections with politics, and particularly with Democratic Party politics and the conventions held in Philadelphia. Now, I want to turn to the women that I promised to talk about with reference to the Spanish Civil War. This woman, Martha Gellhorn, whose picture you saw before, this is a biography of her, Martha Gellhorn. It's called Nothing Ever Happens to the Brave, which is a kind of an odd title, but it's actually a quote from a man who was Martha Gellhorn's second husband. She was his third wife, and he was a famous author. He was a famous author, and she found that the thing that most people remembered about her was that she had been the wife of Ernest Hemingway, who of course is connected with Spain. He was very fond of Spain. He visited in Spain in the 1920s and the 1930s, and he wrote the most famous novel, probably, of the Spanish Civil War, For Whom the Bell Tolls. So there we have pictures of Martha Gellhorn, and now something about her story. She certainly deserves a story on her own, and not just because of her connection with the Spanish Civil War, which she would eventually have, but the fact that she was a very adventurous woman, and as I mentioned before, her mother had tremendous connections, mostly through the League of Women Voters, and she had met Eleanor Roosevelt when Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1920s was active in women's politics through the League of Women Voters, and later served as the wife of the governor of New York State, namely her husband Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Martha Gellhorn actually came eventually to look on Eleanor Roosevelt almost as a second mother, because she was invited to stay several times at the White House. The Roosevelts had a lot of guests who came to the White House, and often they were popular people on the literary scene and so on. It was a little bit before the time that the movie stars were as important as they are today in terms of going to the White House and being seen there in the White House. But about Martha Gellhorn, she was born in 1908 in St. Louis, Missouri, as I mentioned before, and she had an upbringing that was pretty unconventional for the time. Her mother spent a lot of time on the road, actually, with the League of Women Voters and with domestic politics in St. Louis, you know, crusades for clean water, for clean milk, and things along that line. She helped, she and her mother, whose name was Martha, and for whom Martha Gellhorn was named, for her mother, her grandmother, that is, with her, Martha, her grandmother, and with Edna Gellhorn, were very important in setting up a high school in St. Louis in 1923, just in time for Martha Gellhorn to attend. It was called the Burroughs School. It was a private academy. It was co-ed, which was unusual for those days. And the first person enrolled was Martha Gellhorn, you know, our gal who later went on to the Spanish Civil War and so on. Then she attended, after she finished high school in St. Louis, she went to Bryn Mawr, which was her mother's school. And at Bryn Mawr, she was also a very popular student, head of this and that, active in theatrics and so on. And it looked like she was on the road to following her mother's path of graduating from Bryn Mawr, returning to St. Louis, and probably having a conventional married life, but being active in local affairs. However, Martha Gellhorn decided that she did not want to finish college. She was a very good student, but she wanted to get on with her life. And so after her junior year at Bryn Mawr, she left the college, much to the dismay, as you might imagine, of her parents. But she decided she'd go into journalism. And that was in the days before there were big journalism, important journalism schools like we have today at Ohio University. So she just presented herself before a couple of well, one after another, various newspapers. She was briefly on a newspaper in New York City. Then she went up to Albany, and she worked for 6 months on an Albany paper, and this was in 1939, pardon me, in 1929, that she had left. She would have ordinarily graduated in 1930, but she left in 1929, spent 6 months up there in Albany, and then working on a paper on the sort of pedestrian things that people have to do on papers, you know, gather local news and write up articles about local people and times and places of events that are coming up and so on. But then after a visit home in 1929 for Christmas, she went to Europe. Now, she had been to Europe before. Actually, her mother had taken her on vacation at least 3 times to Europe when she was a high school student, I guess probably one time during her years in college as well. So she was a very adventurous person. Here she was, not yet 1929. She was 21. She was old enough to leave home on her own and so on, but quite young and adventurous and on her own in Europe. And she spent a couple of months there, came back to the States for a while, and returned to Europe, where she was out backpacking when she happened to run into a young man named Bertrand de Jouvenel, who was a Frenchman, who was the son of a famous French author, Henri de Jouvenel, and later he himself became a well-known person both in politics and as an author. And they traipsed around Europe together in 1930 and part of 31. And then they came to the United States for a while and did some more traveling around the U.S. And eventually, he was actually already married at the time, but he couldn't resist this blonde adventuress, Martha Gellhorn. And so they became a couple and were actually married in 1933 after he'd obtained a divorce from his wife. So they were married for a couple of years and did some interesting things together. One of the things they did was to buy a car and travel across the American South. And of course, to Jouvenel, and for that matter, you might say also Martha Gellhorn, didn't realize how rough things were down south. I mean, how many, how many poor blacks were there, how many poor whites were there, how many shacks and so forth in the South, and for that matter, across much of America at the time. It was, of course, during the depths of the Depression in the early 1930s, because the Depression began with the fall of the stock market in the fall of 1929, after Martha Gellhorn had already left college. But anyway, they took a trip around the South in their, it was one of those open cars that they had in those days. So it was a place where they got plenty of sun and plenty of dust in their travels across the South. Well, as I say, she was married in 1933 to Bertrand de Jouvenel, and they continued their travels. And but generally, they sort of drifted apart too at the same time, so that they eventually divorced in the mid-1930s. But they remained good friends. They remained good friends to the very end, as it turned out. And she, that is Martha Gellhorn, had a job in the 1934-35 during the Depression. She had a job with the federal government where she, as a seasoned, really, I mean, she'd been doing newspaper work for some years by then. She had published a novel already early in the 1930s, in her early 20s, and she checked on conditions around the U.S. and had some very disturbing revelations to report back to Harry Hopkins, who was a right-hand man to President Franklin Roosevelt. And she spent at least a year doing that kind of work in 1934-35. And she even wrote up a book that she published on that. And it was in that book, in the front of that book, that this "nothing ever happens to the brave" quote was part of the top of the book, sort of reflecting in a way her own bravery in traveling for over a year around the United States and checking in on WPA offices and so on, and reporting back. One thing that she reported was that there was one of these WPA people, I think it might have been in Idaho, it was somewhere in the West, she talked to the men who were working there, and they told her that their leader had thrown their shovels into the lake so that he could requisition a whole new set of shovels and get a kickback or something for buying these shovels. And she told them that they should protest. Well, what did they do but go down to the local office of it wasn't the WPA, but it was the group headed by Harry Hopkins called the FERA, and the office there. And it turned out that after she left town, that they took up her idea of protesting and threw rocks through the windows there of the office, and of course that was became a kind of a scandal, and she had to be absolutely dismissed from her post. But by then she'd had a year, as I say, traveling the country and reporting on the effects of the Great Depression and the efforts to have federal jobs for the unemployed and to help people earn money and to build infrastructure, just like the bridges that were built out Dow Lake, and probably Dow Lake, its dam itself, was dated from the Depression era of the building of a lot of infrastructure in many towns around the U.S. Well, she published a book about these experiences, which became quite popular in 1936. It was published in 1936, in early 1936, just about the time that her father, Dr. Gellhorn, who was an obstetrician in St. Louis, passed away in January of 1936. And so she became fairly well known. This was her second book. 1936, she was still in her late 20s at that time. And she was a very striking-looking woman with blonde hair and beautifully dressed always. And she was featured on the cover of the Saturday Review of Literature in the fall of 1936. Well, by that time, war had started in Spain, as I said. It began in July of 1936. That December, she happened to meet in Florida. She and her mother and brother were on holiday in Florida, and they went to Key West and ran into a famous author who was also associated with Key West as well as Cuba, namely Ernest Hemingway. Well, they struck it up pretty well, and as I say, by then she and Juvenal had, I believe, divorced officially. And early in 1937, Hemingway went to Spain to report on the Spanish Civil War and to support the cause there. There were people from all over the world, literary people who went to Spain to help the Republic to fight against the generals and the Nazis and the fascists in Spain. So, and Martha Gellhorn got a job with the Collier's magazine, which was a popular magazine back in the 30s and 40s. I remember reading Collier's myself as a little girl. She got a job with Collier's that she could submit to them stories from Spain, and that's what she did. And but she was sort of tagging along with Hemingway, who was married to his second wife at the time, but the wife was staying home raising sons, you know, so here he was in Spain, and they were in the same hotel and did a lot of traveling together to the front, to the trenches, and did reporting. And in this book, at the end, there is a lengthy list of all the publications that Martha Gellhorn ever had, and it goes on and on and on about the things. And some of her first stories were from Spain, but she had, as I said, already published 2 books by the time she went to Spain. So they were in Spain together, and she saw him there, and she was involved with they made a sort of a propaganda movie. She wasn't that involved, but Hemingway was the narrator for this movie called The Spanish Earth. And it was done by a Frenchman named Joris Ivers. But Hemingway came back to the United States, and Martha Gellhorn came back at that same time in the summer of 1937, and he narrated the film called The Spanish Earth. And she and he both tried to get places in movie houses to show it. It was a documentary favoring the Spanish Republic. So that was part of her connection with the Spanish Civil War. And she went back later in 1937. She was there during part of 1938. And from time to time, articles of hers would appear in Collier's magazine and some other magazines in the United States. So she became essentially a war correspondent, you might say. And that was her fame. She actually was a war correspondent not only in the Spanish Civil War, but in the Russo-Finnish War, which occurred in 1939-40 winter. She went to China. China and Japan were at war beginning in 1937, and so on. So she became essentially a war correspondent. And she married Hemingway after his divorce to his second wife. She became his third wife and was his wife from about 1940 to 45. And actually, that was not a, they probably had a better time together before they were married than they did after they were married. Anyway, Gellhorn wound up very unfavorable to Hemingway, unlike the way she felt toward her first husband, Bertrand de Juvenal. They were friends to the end. But she wound up absolutely hating Hemingway and he hating her, and them sniping at each other when they had the opportunity and so on. And it was really ironic to her that she was always associated with Hemingway as being his third wife. Of course, he married again, and his last wife, Mary Hemingway. But one of the things that they had done was to go to China, at that time fighting the Japanese in 1940, before the U.S. went to war. She was later a war correspondent for a time in Europe. She didn't actually go in on the beaches at D-Day. There weren't any women there, but she soon was posting some articles from Europe in 1944, 1945. Later, she reported on the Korean War. She reported on the Vietnam War. She even reported on the Yugoslav Civil War in the 1990s, which was at the very end of her life because she died in 1992. Now, if Matt is still around, Matt, are you there?
Yep.
Matt?
Yep.
Yeah. Could you show some of those pictures from the Spanish Civil War that we had the other day but were unable to show? There's a picture. What these are cards. There are 6 cards to a page. These are so-called war cards, and these war cards, these are from a reprint set of war cards. But for instance, the one up at the top of the page on the left shows churches in flames in the sort of revolutionary times that preceded the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War itself. That shows a burning church in Madrid in early 1936. The next picture over next to all those flames up at the top shows the funeral of the man and his death, and the death, he was a rightist monarchist leader who was assassinated in Madrid on July 10th or 11th, 1936, and it was one of the things that set off the Spanish Civil War was his murder. The next one down in the middle shows 2 men on horseback. One of those men is General Franco. These war cards came out in the year 1938, and my husband, Bob Whaley, as a little boy, would buy the war cards. They came 2 to a package with a slice of gum in between. They came out in 1938, printed in Philadelphia, and were popularly called war cards. Next shows a man with a top hat he's got in his hand, and that was the last president, Azania, of the Second Spanish Republic, saying farewell to Spain in 1939, just shortly before the military took over with General Franco as the main. And at the bottom are the two most valuable cards, if they were originals. They both show Hitler. One on the left shows Hitler and Chamberlain at Munich, and the one on the right shows Hitler with all the Nazi flags in the background. It shows Hitler haranguing the crowds at a party rally in Nuremberg, Germany, of the Nazi Party. The next page shows up at the top Almeria being shelled by a German warship. They shelled the warship, Nazi warship, shelled Almeria, Spain, because someone had fired on the warship from the shore. And we have pictures. You see 3 pictures of airplanes. Those are all German planes that fought in Spain, 2 in the middle there and 1 at the bottom. And the man down at the bottom corner there is Benito Mussolini. While Hitler sent mostly aviators and tank men to Spain who perfected the Blitzkrieg idea, and the German planes destroyed Guernica, the Italians were mostly foot soldiers. They say that something like 80,000 Italians fought in Spain, and quite a few of them actually died there, fought in Spain for Mussolini. Meanwhile, the international brigades of people from all over the world who were leftists who wanted to support the Spanish Republic in the international brigades, there were Italian units there that were leftists in exile from Mussolini's Italy. And then the last page that we see here shows Franco troops up at the top, and the horrors of war, which luckily you can't see because there's a headless woman here on the right side of the top page. But these war cards were pretty gory, you know, and actually the kids thought, hey, these are pretty cool, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, they had that opinion often. There's a picture here of bombers in the middle there. You can hardly see them, but there are 3 huge orange planes up in the sky dropping bombs on Spain in that particular war card. Each of these cards on the back has, an explanation of what's going on. Often it would be a clipping from a newspaper that was printed on the back. The black and white and gray thing that you see in the middle row is a tiny picture, you won't be able to appreciate it, of Guernica, the famous picture by Pablo Picasso, probably the most famous modern picture of the 20th century, the 1900s. That was after the Germans bombed the little Basque town of Guernica in April of 1937. Picasso, who was working in Spain, not in Spain, but in Paris at the time, painted up this huge, huge mural of Guernica, his idea of Guernica, showing a bull and a horse and bombing, woman with her arms outstretched at the top, a mother with a dying child, so on. This picture was very famous, and it was at the Museum of Modern Art for many years in New York City, and I saw it as a college student when I went to New York City in 1939 for the first time at the Museum of Modern Art. And it was there until Picasso had said it was not to return to Spain until after the death of Franco, or at least after the renewal of a democratic government in Spain. So it was returned to Spain in 1981. And then at the bottom on the right, you see a man in a white jacket with a white hat, and he's saluting. There is the Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, which gave a lot of aid to the Republic. But a lot of that aid was actually paid for by Spanish gold that was sent to the Soviet Union in the fall of 1936. And after the gold finally ran out in 1938 and wasn't available to pay for arms and so on, the Soviet aid gradually dried up. Well, there we have some stories from the Spanish Civil War, which is started 80 years ago this week in July 1936, and we've heard about the Martha Gellhorn, the war correspondent, who all her life knew famous people and was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt and the third wife of Ernest Hemingway, and so on, and went to most of the major wars of the 20th century as a war correspondent. Martha Gellhorn, originally of St. Louis, Missouri. So the only other one I want to mention very quickly is La Pasionaria, the Spanish communist official who had to leave Spain at the end of the Civil War, and she lived for years and years, decades, in the Soviet Union. La Pasionaria, who was a Basque from the northern Spain, communist, and she returned to Spain in 1977. At the end of her life, she lived her last 4 years, and she was once again in the Spanish parliament called the Cortes. La Pasionaria, Dolores Ibarruri, famous for the slogan, "No pasarán," they shall not pass, which she said on the radio in 1936 when the rightists first started the Civil War in Spain. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.